What is the future of inter-Korean engagement? And what will happen next between Donald Trump and Lee Jae-myung when they meet at APEC next week? All this and more next on The Impossible State. North Korea is the impossible state. It's a place that stumped leaders and policymakers for more than 3 decades. It has a complex history, and it has become one of the United States' top national security priorities. Each week on this show, we'll talk to the people who know the most about North Korea. Welcome to another episode of the CSIS Impossible State podcast. I'm your host, Victor Cha, President of Geopolitics and Korea Chair at CSIS, as well as Professor at Georgetown. Today we're going to talk about the future of inter-Korean engagement, as well as the next summit meeting that is anticipated between Donald Trump and Lee Jae-myung, their second summit meeting, which will take place on the sidelines of APEC in Gyeongju, Korea, next week. And we have 2 wonderful guests to discuss these topics with us today. Neither of them will be a surprise to any of you. They're good friends of CSIS and good friends of the show. Dr. Andrew Yo is Senior Fellow and SK Korea Foundation Chair at Brookings and the Center for East Asian Policy Studies. He's also Professor of Politics at the Catholic University of America. He is the author or editor of 6 books, including his most recent book, Great Power Competition and Overseas Bases, Chinese, Russian, and American Force Posture in the 21st Century. And that was published by Brookings last year. Andrew, thanks for being on the show again.
It's great to be back here again, Victor.
Good. And of course, our good friend, sometimes host of the show, Sid Seiler. Sid Seiler is Senior Advisor to the Korea Chair at CSIS. And all of you who follow our work know him very well. From 2020 to 2023, he was the NIO, the National Intelligence Officer for North Korea at the National Intelligence Council. Before that, he was Senior Defense Intelligence Expert for North Korea and Senior Analyst at U.S. Forces Korea. And before that, he was Special Envoy for the 6 Party Talks, as well as Director for Korea on the National Security Council. So 2 terrific guests to discuss a very interesting topic. One of them is a little bit philosophical, the future of inter-Korean engagement, and the other is actually quite policy relevant as we head into the next week, where we expect to see not just APEC, but also meetings between Donald Trump and Lee Jae-myung. So let's first start with this whole question of inter-Korean engagement. In September, President Lee Jae-myung announced something called the E.N.D, or E.N.D. There's this penchant for acronyms, I think, in Korean foreign policy. Every time they announce a new foreign policy, E.N.D stands for Exchange, Normalization, and Denuclearization. He announced this during his UN address during the UN General Assembly meetings in New York last September. So to start off, can you just briefly explain to our audience who may not have been watching the UN General Assembly proceedings? I know it's not the top-rated show on television. What this initiative is. So, Andrew, do you want to tell us what this is about?
Well, I will say when BTS was at the UN General Assembly, it may have been the top-watched program then. But to get to your question about END, END's an acronym for Exchange, Normalization, and Denuclearization. It's a three-pronged phased approach that is designed to, quote, end the Cold War on the Korean Peninsula. And it's really promoting this transition from hostility to peaceful coexistence and then eventually denuclearization. So it's really the Lee Jae-myung's policy towards North Korea. And I think it was done in part to signal a shift away from the previous government's policy on inter-Korea policy on North Korea, which many argued was a unification by absorption. But that's essentially what it is, exchange, normalization, denuclearization.
Yeah. And so how is this not, I mean, you said, Andrew, that it's different from Yun, and that's probably true. But these words, exchange, normalization, and denuclearization, these are not new words. We've heard them all before. How is this, Sid, how is this just like not the same old wine in a new bottle?
I think it's a branding that President Lee and his team hope will convince the United States and the international audience not to give up on seeking to engage with North Korea, even if for the near term it looks like denuclearization is not likely to be one of the top priority issues that Pyongyang will be willing to talk about. I remember during my stay at State Department, we went through about a year where we had some detainee negotiations that North Korea put front and center. They wanted a cabinet level official to come in and bring Kenneth Bae out of North Korea. And, in the meantime, they just absolutely refused to talk about anything else. And so, we had to have a strategy that showed flexibility even while North Korea was not. So I think what E.N.D will lead to is just a reaffirmation. Any close student of this issue will know it's not really true that other regimes, other governments, Park Geun-hye, Lee Myung-bak, Yoon Suk-yeol, or going back even further, placed unification by absorption as a more higher priority goal. I think others have been willing to talk about preparing for unification. Others have talked about the need for a solid posture in the light of the growing North Korea threat. But there has not been, either in Washington or Seoul for decades now, a government that has not been willing to engage with North Korea.
So when we look at the sequencing of this, right? Exchange, normalization, denuclearization, right? The exchange and the normalization part are sort of consistent broadly with inter-Korean policy, right? Well, like you said, conservatives or progressive governments have always wanted to have some sort of exchange and normalization with North Korea. But the denuclearization part, do you think that's in there to assuage the United States of any concerns that a progressive government in Korea would place exchange and normalization above denuclearization or shelve denuclearization just for the sake of having exchange? Do you think that's why they've inserted this as sort of the third piece of that, or they just needed something that had a D in the end?
Yeah, no, I actually do think that it was intended to signal to Washington that denuclearization is still a part of South Korea's framework for inter-Korea policy. Actually, Sid and I had a brief exchange beforehand, and Sid was asking, well, why do you think they picked an English acronym E.N.D? Is it really for international broadcasting? So I think that's part of it. My sense also is that the Lee government knows that if there was, clearly Lee wants to engage with North Korea, but if there's no discussion on denuclearization or nothing on defense or deterrence, that would not attract the United States or the Trump administration. So they knew that in order to have any buy-in from the U.S., that they would need to include denuclearization. And I also think the Lee government understands that they're not going to be the ones, so the Lee government is not going to set the pace on the resumption of inter-Korea dialogues. I think they understand that right now Kim only wants to meet with Trump and vice versa. And so in some ways, I feel like E.N.D is also a way to signal to the U.S. that if there is a process between the U.S. and North Korea, that somehow Korea can be relevant as well, too. So, yes, it definitely is, I think, a signal towards the U.S.
It's almost like an ideological shift or a theoretical shift from when you and I were involved in the six-party talks. You think about 2 decades ago. It was, common understanding at the time that denuclearization had to precede peace, because the central destabilizing element in Northeast Asia was nothing other than the North Korean nuclear program. And any attempts to move forward on peace without any assurance that we were on some type of credible track towards denuclearization didn't make sense. North Korea has worked hard to try to flip that. China, by calling for stability first and denuclearization through negotiation second, had flipped that model years ago. And I think there's an approach now that will send the impression out there that solving some peace issue is of greater priority than denuclearization. And I think that's where we enter dangerous territory, because it gives leverage to North Korea to ratchet up tension, make threats, engage in their classic blackmail diplomacy, and exacting concessions from us just for eventually at some point coming to the table having a few rounds of talks, no doubt, about all the things we do to heighten tensions on the peninsula, why we need to roll back exercises, why we need to roll back U.S. forces Korea, strategic asset signaling, all the things that we work so hard to credibly meet the challenge of the North Korean nuclear threat over the past few years. I think if we do a peace-first approach, risk severely weakening our capabilities. And I think this is what you also addressed somewhat in the foreign affairs piece that you did about what a bad deal might look like, how it might threaten the very peace and deterrence that we have today.
Yeah. Let me ask you now about North Korea's response to this. It seems to me that North Korea has already made clear that they don't want, the only condition under which they'll meet Trump is if we don't talk about denuclearization, right? So if you create a policy that has denuclearization in it, right? Engagement, normalization, denuclearization, and you already know what the North Korean position is, like, do you actually expect this thing to succeed in any way? Or put more broadly, the Lee government has tried some unilateral things, right, to ratchet down tensions. What has been the North Korean response generally to all of this? Start with you, Andrew.
Sure. Well, the North Koreans have responded. Kim Jong-un on September 21st, and I just pulled out some direct quotes at the 13th session of the Supreme People's Assembly. He said, "There will be no reason to sit face to face, and we will do nothing together. I make clear that we will in no way engage." Or he said, "The Republic of Korea is a half-paralyzed monstrosity, Americanized in every field, a colonial vassal state, and a thoroughly alien other country." So it's basically the middle finger to South Korea and to Lee Jae-myung that they don't want to engage. They see South Korea as a separate, hostile state. And then when you include the word denuclearization, Kim Jong-un said that even with the United States, that we can have talks, but you just can't bring up denuclearizations. So why would Lee bring up this word? Again, I think he understands that for Kim, it's a non-starter, but if this message is aimed at as much at the United States and the international community as it is North Korea, then he again realizes that you can't have a policy without including denuclearization. And if I could add one more thought, if we think about the way I think discourse or trends are heading in Washington and the U.S. about North Korea policy, I do think that there's a growing consensus that there needs to be some focus on risk mitigation, reducing tensions, and that's where you get back to this sequencing of, do we need to have exchange or some degree of normalization? I don't like the word normalization, but at least some basis to restart diplomacy before you can get back to the denuclearization. So I think it's recognition of what President Lee talks about as a pragmatic approach or policy, that on the grounds, it's a fact that North Korea has nuclear weapons, so we should proceed based on what that reality is. And perhaps South Korea, I haven't asked anyone directly in the Lee government, but perhaps they sense where also Washington is at. And who knows what Trump may do as well in terms of his views on what the sequencing should be. But it could be possible that Trump doesn't even care as much about denuclearization, or it may not be a thing for him. I think the Trump administration itself is concerned with denuclearization. But anyway, including denuclearization is, I think, important to South Korea as well. And so they're not going to promote an inter-Korea engagement policy without that word or phrase, denuclearization.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that the president has demonstrated a desire to engage with adversaries. We've known that since term one, and it's a good thing in his logic that brings us an opportunity to develop some type of political capital that can be used at leverage at the right time. And if we don't talk to these adversaries, what do we get out of it? So what is the harm of, as some people are now speculating, shooting up to Panmunjom this next week when everybody's in town?
CNN reports.
Right.
That. Yeah.
It sounds credible to me in that it would be bringing back memories of 2019 when he made a similar visit. It was all about symbolism. Nothing really concrete came out of it, but nothing really. The good news about the peace issue is North Korea, compared to other hotspots in the world, the Korean Peninsula, unlike other hotspots in the world, is not on the verge of some type of cataclysmic, conflict. And so there's not a sense of urgency with a set of objectives that you have to fill. Going and building relationship brings an aura of peace to the whole issue. And the president can say he's reaching out to reduce peace, reduce tension. So I think, meeting Kim would be advancing that objective. On the two Koreas piece, if I could just briefly say this, I mean, we are in a period of incredible transparency on North Korea's part. I often would describe the two Koreas as irrevocably and irreconcilably in antithesis. These are two vastly different systems, each of which are an ontological threat to the other just for being there, right? And so between the SPA session speech from this year that you read, Andrew, and the one that went back to 2024 to an earlier session of the same 14 SPA,
SPA for our
the Supreme
friends,
People's
Supreme
Assembly,
People's Assembly,
their rubber
yeah.
stamp legislative body, the speeches before which Kim, over the past several years, has made major policy announcements. And that is the one where he laid out, we're not pursuing unification. We're going to dismantle anything that has to do with unification. All the organizations like the United Front Department, the Committee for the Peaceful Reunification of the Fatherland, all these things would go away. And South Korea we'll call it the Republic of Korea. We have no affinity with them. All of this amplified with Kim Yo-jong's statements and other, like the statements you mentioned, pretty much, we say North Korea never paints itself into a corner, which is, I think, where the hope for E.N.D. or some type of engagement leading to normalization within, particularly among South Korean progressives, there's still hope out there. And there always is. North Korea never completely paints itself into a corner, but its language over the past few years has been so definitive in essentially saying to the South Republic of Korea, we're not interested. It doesn't matter whether progressive or conservative, you all are out for the same thing. You want to crush us, you want to unify us through absorption, you want a united Korea, liberal democracy, free market like that in the South today, and there's just no way we're interested in that.
But do you think that some of that sort of absolutism by the North, I mean, we really saw that in the aftermath. I mean, it coincided with UN being power, but it was really in the aftermath of the summitry with the United States. Mm-hmm. Then we went into a 3.5-year COVID lockdown in North Korea, so we heard nothing from them during that period. But then coming out of that, we saw this absolutist sort of view of completely separating from the South and not wanting to talk. Do you think some of that, and you said whether they're angry with both conservatives and progressive, do you think some of that is because they feel that they took a huge diplomatic gamble with Donald Trump the first time around, and it did not work out well for them? It failed miserably.
I think the failure was cooked into the planning. Mm-hmm. And let me explain why. By the end of 2018, we already saw North Korea signaling South Korea that it was going to walk back from a rapid pace of implementation of the September agreement, the comprehensive military agreement, that it was slowing the pace. And we saw from that point onward repeated our demand of South Korea. Stop cooperating with the United States, because remember at that time, exchange and cooperation were having some difficulties because of the concerns about whether they were violating sanctions or not. So we set up a U.S. ROK working group that would help facilitate these. And North Korea said, stop listening to the United States. Take the nuclear issue off the table. The nuclear issue is not an inter-Korea issue. You've got to stop insisting on talking about denuclearization. And then finally, don't let sanctions become an obstacle to exchange and cooperation. And those three demands were repeated on a regular basis throughout 2019, 2020. And of course, President Moon Jae-in held fast on all three. We kept the working group. He did not ignore the nuclear issue. And they did not stop enforcing sanctions. So what North Korea Kim looked at that period, 2018, 2019, it was a good measure of what he could get from the inter-Korea relationship without denuclearizing. And at the end of the day, it wasn't interesting enough. I think what happened in Hanoi, remember, let's not forget, North Korea had an opportunity to reach out after Hanoi. We had the meeting in the DMZ, we had the meeting in Stockholm later that year. If North Korea wanted to keep the process going forward, I know because this is the same thing we experienced between Obama term 1 and Obama term 2, which I was down at the NSC at the time for. If they had an interest to continue to go forward with the U.S., they could have easily. And they walked away just like they walked away Obama term 2. Now I think North Korea sees some value in engaging the U.S. simply because they know it will help position them to try to put a wedge between Seoul and Washington, make Lee Jae-myung soften his policy even more. But I don't think that, South Koreans, I think part of it is it's so hard to accept the fact that North Korea just fundamentally doesn't want a good relationship with the South. And so the inclination to say, well, it's because U.S. DPRK relations are bad that we can't kickstart inter-Korea relations. So if we could just get Trump talking to Kim, then everything will fall into line. I hope that's the case. But my sense is the signaling to Lee Jae-myung is deliberate and definitive. Final, irrevocable, probably not. And that's what I think Lee Jae-myung very pragmatically sees as his goal with E.N.D. and all the other, good things that he's been doing in terms of addressing the hostile actions, concerns of North Korea with leaflets and broadcast and refraining from calling for unification.
Can I jump in to make a quick point? Because
Yeah.
I have a somewhat different take. I agree with Sid that, the context now, post, Hanoi, post-summitry in 2018, 2019 is different, so that it would be, I'm also skeptical that North Korea wants to engage with the South. But in terms of reversing this non-dialogue policy, we have to remember in 2017, this was a period of fire and fury. Moon Jae-in was sending all sorts of signals that he wanted to restart engagement. And this is coming off the heels of the Park Geun-hye administration, where there was very little engagement between North and South Korea. But all through that summer and fall, North Koreans completely ignored Moon Jae-in and and then 2018, it's like a 180-degree turn as the Pyeongchang Olympics helped pave that way. But it shows that North Korea is willing to flip on the switch of a dime. And I'm not saying that will happen again, but if there is a U.S. North Korea diplomatic process in place, it's possible that Kim Jong-un may once again decide that he would reach out to Lee Jae-myung. So there is that precedence there.
I would just say, having looked at this, looking, for example, at the high-level North-South talks in the 92, 93 time period, then you fast forward ahead to, the thaw of 2000, Kim Jong-il, Kim Dae-jung summit, Madeleine Albright visits North Korea, and then the next when you look at these periods of engagement, there's a deliberate nature to the launching of them. And we were predicting in the middle of 2017, amid the Missile a Month madness, that Kim, once he achieved his R&D goal, would pivot to diplomacy to try to mitigate all the pressure that had happened. If you recall, remember China and Russia signing on for Security Council resolution sanctions they never would have thought of beforehand. So Kim saw an opportunity to use the Olympics to pivot to diplomacy and to sit across from his counterparts, Seoul, Washington, to a lesser degree, Beijing and Moscow, as a now nuclear power. Not as somebody looking for ways to denuclearize, but one way seeking to normalize his existence as a nuclear power. And that's what really motivated him to come back. And you're right, he may do that again.
So that pivot, that inflection point could be Kim, getting the blessing of Putin and then Xi. And if he meets Trump at that point, I think Kim would have a really strong hand, to come and meet with Lee Jae-myung at that point. So again, there has to be some. You said that there's a clear messaging strategy in place for the North Koreans when they decide to come back to negotiations. So for us, it's to figure out what and when is that point. And so it could be that North Koreans are just biding time and building leverage before they decide that they want to come back and meet the South Koreans. I think they will eventually. It's just a question of of when.
Right.
Let me ask you if there is any. So you mentioned China and Russia. So let's bring them into the discussion. I mean, in the past, there were positioning and leverage reasons for the North to decide when it wanted to engage with the South. In the past, there were also material incentives, right? There was this cycle of fertilizer and food. Right. To what extent does that even matter anymore, or is this entirely being provided by China and Russia today? I read a report over the weekend that said China-North Korea bilateral trade was like last quarter or something was like at an all-time high. Like, do these material incentives for engaging with the South matter anymore, or are they completely irrelevant now? Andrew?
I think they matter significantly less. As you mentioned, they're getting supplies, probably food aid from Russia. It doesn't really have the same traction that it would have in the, after the famine of the 1990s and the 2000s, even in the 2010s. I think that would have been attractive. Lee Myung-bak had his Vision 3000 policy, which was to try to raise the GDP of North Korea, but also providing humanitarian assistance. So it doesn't have that kind of suasion that it may have in the past. I think North Korea is looking for things like diplomatic recognition or recognition, status, recognition of its nuclear its nuclear status. I think that's what's more important right now than things like food aid or other forms of humanitarian assistance.
Yeah, this is a great discussion when we look at the hostile policy list. He's got one for the United States, and he's got one for South Korea, which the United States one was issued in a KCNA statement around the 2014 time period. Very exhaustive list of everything the United States has allegedly done that the North sees as hostile. And then more recently, I believe in the readout of one or both of these two speeches we talked about. And for listeners, viewers out there, it's worth going back and digging these speeches up, where there's kind of now a list that Lee Jae-myung likely is looking at and say, okay, let's stop the loudspeakers, let's stop the leaflets, let's stop the references to unification, let's show respect for the system. And in that regard, I think they're going to find out what we found out, for example, when we lifted North Korea from the state sponsors of terrorism list, is that didn't earn you anything. It didn't really. We thought it would, and at the end of the day, there were other reasons to remove them at the time, and it was an irritant that we could remove, but removing it was not, a definitive action. So this is going to be, I think, the challenge for Lee Jae-myung is how far is he willing to meet North Korea's demands without any evidence it will really advance the inter-Korean cause.
Yeah. So we have about 10 minutes left. Let's shift to talk about APEC and the U.S. Korea meeting next week. This would be the second meeting between Donald Trump and Lee Jae-myung. The last time was here, August 25th in Washington, D.C. It went fairly well, I think, for most people thought, on the heels of the tariff and investment framework agreement. But a lot has happened since then. And I think what everybody's looking at going forward is whether they're actually going to be able to nail down all the details of this tariff and investment framework agreement. That's certainly been what all the movement back and forth, all the diplomacy has been taking place. There's a regular sort of train of South Korean very high-level officials, right? Deputy cabinet ministers, chief of staff even, coming to D.C. to meet with the trio, Lutnick, Bessent, and Greer. Andrew, what do you think are the prospects going forward here? So now we're moving out of this very interesting and partly theoretical, partly policy discussion on inter-Korean engagement into inside the Beltway speculation. So, Andrew, what is your considered opinion on what's going to happen?
Well, it really is speculation because as you mentioned last week, you had South Korean negotiators that were here. I was trying to look at the meeting. This is Monday, October 20th, and they haven't actually announced or released if there was any if the ball had moved forward on any of these trade negotiations, the news reports were that they had just met. At the heart here is the $350 billion investment that the South Koreans have pledged to the United States, and they're still trying to figure out a way on how to structure this funds. And Trump had said even I think last week again that the Koreans had agreed to make that payment up front. That's something that the Koreans can't do. I think structurally, I think their country would collapse economically if they were to just fork over that much.
So I agree with you. So the question is like, if it was that difficult, why did they agree to $350 billion? Were they that desperate to get the tariff rate down? But I mean,
I think because the strategy and what everyone had been telling, not just the Koreans, but other world leaders, is that you have to show a big figure, that it's really about the optics and getting together a large package. And I do think that there is, it's more aspirational. I do think that the Koreans felt that there's enough areas of cooperation on shipbuilding, on semiconductors, on that they could actually come up with a large investment. Now, whether it's $350 billion versus $250 billion, the details don't really matter to Trump. So that's probably why they put out that figure. But now it's coming back to bite them in the butt, because Trump is saying, well, where is this money? How is it going to come? When is it going to come? And that's where we're still stuck. So will there be a deal by the time of APEC? So that's next week. The Koreans are feeling the pressure. They feel that Trump is coming. He's to Gyeongju. He's going to meet President Lee, and they have to show something for it. My sense is that it's, they're not going to be able to give the 350 up front, but it might be a question of timing. There's a lot of thought about, can they do something that the Japanese have done in terms of identifying key, investments, coming up with a deal, and then putting a time frame for when that funding can come by, depending on each. So it's by investment by investment, not the 350 billion all at once. Yeah, so it's incremental. Mm-hmm. But I think the Koreans are still pushing off on that. And so it is really speculation. And so whether they can get to a deal, you can't say definitively with a yes or a no. I think the Koreans will try to talk about other issues where I've heard there has been more progress on the security, on security issues, but on the trade deal.
This has been sucking all the oxygen out of the room, right? I mean, they have probably had good things to announce last August on the security side, right? They apparently had reached some agreements, but it was all taken up. They couldn't reach an agreement on the details, so they didn't issue anything written, right, in the first summit meeting, which, as you and I know, like the first summit meeting between the two leaders, it's absolutely critical to get a joint statement out, the joint vision statement or something, right? Because that sets basically the homework for both sides going forward, and they couldn't do that just because they still have been arguing over the terms of this investment framework agreement, right?
I mean, the good news is it's South Korea we're negotiating with and not North Korea. It's both of our sides want a deal, right? And so there's got to be a win-win solution out there somewhere, and it's not going to be easy. It's never easy, and Donald Trump is a experienced negotiator, and part of that is backfooting your counterpart and surprising them and making sure you've explored every last inch of compromise that can be achieved. But the positive statements coming out of both Washington and Seoul over the past week kind of make me optimistic that certainly it won't disrupt or undermine the summit itself or APEC. If there's things left unresolved, there'll be things left unresolved. There's still time to work these things out. My
sense is if they can identify at least one area where they can put in money, that would be considered new, not something that was from the Biden era that the Koreans have pledged, but say that this is really clearly under Trump. Let's say, just a hypothetical, but let's say in the shipbuilding area, if the Koreans say, okay, we're going to make a clear pledge of, X billion amount of dollars, and then we can, they can transfer the fund. I think if they can have at least one tangible, concrete project, that could help. That could get the ball rolling, and they still won't have all the details, but at least they have something to show or announce when they get to APEC.
Buy some time.
In the end, all the negotiations in this administration will come down to Trump, right? In the end, it'll come down to Trump, and Bessent, Lutnick, and Greer can make very strong arguments about what the deal should look like, how it should be structured. But if Trump doesn't like it, he may increase the leverage, right? He's holding the tariff rates now, right, at 25%, hasn't reduced them to 15%. He could raise them again. But in one sense, this Chinese action against these U.S. subsidiaries, right, of the Korean shipbuilding company, that may actually work to the advantage of the U.S. and Korea, because Trump may want to be able to hit back at that by doing something, making this deal with the Koreans, particularly on shipbuilding.
Yeah,
like if
I wonder if that's why the Chinese had identified. I mean, they saw this coming. They could have done it earlier, but the timing is, right before APEC, where Xi Jinping may also be, he was going to attend as well. It's as if, is there something that's going to happen on the shipbuilding, and suddenly, bam, the Chinese come in with sanctions on Korean companies. So I don't know, but it makes me think that maybe there's something there on the shipbuilding front that could help them narrow the gap or build the bridge between the U.S. and Korea side on how to structure this $350 billion investment.
Yeah. So the last thing, and we already referenced it a couple of times already, but so what do you think is going to happen next week? Do you think there will be a quick trip up to Panmunjom or something like that? Gyeongju is not that far from Panmunjom. I doubt he's even staying in Gyeongju. I don't know. What do you think?
I think it's possible.
Really?
I do.
Yeah.
Well, this wouldn't be the Impossible State podcast without you posing that question. So I did give it some thought. I think it's highly unlikely. I think just because of the schedule, Trump's only there for one night, 2 days. And because of the Xi-Trump meeting, that's probably taking up all the bandwidth or resources of U.S. government. I think it's going to be difficult. But there is still a slight chance it's Trump after all. And if you remember what happened in Panmunjom in 2019, he was willing to come up just on the basis of a tweet. So I'm not going to say it's impossible, but I think it's very slim chance that it's going to happen.
I would just like to add that if it doesn't happen, it's not because North Korea's current position on denuclearization is diametrically opposed to ours. I think both sides have enough wiggle room in the wording and how we could approach it, that this difference on denuclearization as a goal can be overcome for a one-off meeting, particularly a one-off meeting, quick meeting, Panmunjom, how you doing? Good to see you again. Our teams need to work this out going forward.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it is not at all inconceivable that Donald Trump could here in Washington, D.C. say, we denuclearization, that's our goal, that's our policy, and then go up to Panmunjom and say, Kim Jong-un is a nuclear power. Like, that's not inconceivable at all. And I agree, like, even if it's a short meeting, in the broader scheme of things, with all that the United States has to deal with these days, it wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing. Right? It's a sort of keeping tabs, keeping in contact, right? It's not necessarily it wouldn't necessarily be a terrible thing given all that the United States has to deal with these days. So, well, we shall see, I guess. Maybe we'll have you back right after the APEC summit, and we can do a post game analysis of the events of that week. Anyway, thank you, Sid and Andrew, for joining us again on The Impossible State. Thank you to all of our listeners and viewers. We hope you enjoy APEC next week and the meetings between Xi and Trump and President Lee and President Trump, and who knows who else we'll meet. We'll see you on the next episode.
Yeah, thanks.